Good morning. This, by the way, I will warn you, this is going to be at least semi-interactive. So the point of interactivity is when I ask you a question, you respond, and we kind of all get into it together. Even all of you that are back at home through the chat function, I hope, can engage and have a discussion here. So my name is Geoff Tuff. I have spent a lot of time over time in the field of innovation and innovation strategy. Most of what I'm going to, in fact, everything I'm going to be talking about today actually comes from some research and writing that I've been doing over the course of the last 15 years or so. Just slight correction, the latest book that's come out is actually a book called Provoke, which is up on the screen there. This came out about 2 weeks ago. The subtitle of the book is How Leaders Shape the Future by Overcoming Fatal Human Flaws. So I'm going to land on that today after starting with a little bit of setup around my previous book, Detonate, and hopefully this will actually be a discussion. So, to get into it, and warning, this is the participatory part. How many of you are athletes? Okay, that's seriously pathetic. There were like 3 timid hands that went up in the back of the room. How many of you very episodically move faster than a walk? Okay, so you're all athletes of some sort. Tell me what you like to do for your athletics. Just yell it out. Running. Golfing. Skiing. More running. Swimming. Does anyone do this? Show of hands. Does anyone know what that is? Yes, what is it? It is the high jump. Kinda. But it's not really what the high jump looks like these days. But for many, many years, that is what the high jump looked like. Up through the 20s and 30s and 40s, when a track and field coach would teach someone how to do the high jump, they would say something like, all right, you're going to back up about 40 meters, and then you're going to run as fast as you can and hurl yourself feet first over the bar. Which sounds totally goofy today, because this guy came along at the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games, and he introduced a different way of doing things. That style that you see on the left-hand side is called the Fosbury flop these days. The person was Dick Fosbury, and I bring all this up not because I know anything about the high jump, which I don't, but because I love the quote that he brought to the Mexico City Olympic Games that you see on the right-hand side here. So what he said at the time was, I was told over and over again that I would never be successful, that I was not going to be competitive, and the technique was simply not going to work. All I could do was shrug and say, we'll just have to see. That's the mindset that we all have to adopt increasingly in the face of megatrends. And in the face of all the change that Anders just talked about, we can't operate without curiosity and without just doing things and seeing what happens. So I've been in the field of strategy consulting, innovation strategy consulting for almost 30 years at this point, and I'll tell you, it's a pretty good gig. I get to go and speak to some of the world's most successful executives at the most successful companies and talk about innovation. And just to be clear, I have a very simple definition of what innovation is, and it is the creation of new economic value. So there's always been good reasons to go and think about creating new economic value. You may have your shareholders' expectations shifting. You may have new executives who come into the company and say, we have to innovate, we have to do things differently. But increasingly, what we're finding is what's impacting the need to innovate is technology and the nature of technological change. Because the problem we've had for the past, I'll say 20 or 30 years with innovation is that whenever I go into these executive conversations and I leave the room, they say, you know, or most of the time they say, I enjoyed that conversation, we should continue the conversation, why don't you come back? And I come back and they say, love what you're saying, but I gotta close the books. I gotta wrap up the quarter. So come back in 3 months and why don't we have another conversation then? What happens 3 months later? There's another quarter to close, and then another quarter to close. And the reality is, innovation has never really been that urgent. It's been really important. We all love to talk about it. We all love to think about it. But we don't love to do it because we have more short-term needs that we need to focus on. But that's changing. And without sounding too hyperbolic, it is really important that we pay attention to the change, because innovation is becoming urgent. And it's becoming urgent because of the nature of change itself and the reality that change is accelerating. So we have, for many, many years, for the history of humankind, we have lived in a world of linear change. Things don't change that fast. And that means they're somewhat predictable. We can look to the past for lessons for the future, and we can usually make pretty decent decisions. What we've seen, though, over the course of the last, call it 6 or 7 years, and especially in the last 3 or 4, is the impact of exponential change all around us. I think at this point, most people know about Moore's Law, and they know that Gordon Moore back in the 60s predicted that the computing power of semiconductors would roughly double every 18 months to 2 years for the same price point. And if you extrapolate that prediction back through 100 years of computing history, well before the semiconductor, it's a demonstrable exponential curve. The thing with exponential curves, though, is they look totally different from linear curves. So if I had to just draw a linear curve that, let's just say it's something going up, an exponential curve has very different characteristics at the beginning. It kind of looks like it's bumping along doing nothing. But at some point, it crosses the point of our linear expectations, and we pay attention to it. And we say, whoa, geez, that's real. That actually is something I need to pay attention to. But the problem is when an exponential curve crosses our linear expectations, it seems to shoot up almost immediately, and there's no time to do anything about it. It's too late if that's when you're paying attention to exponentials. So the problem behind all of this is not the technologies and all the cool things we can do with exponential technologies, and there are a lot. Artificial reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, all these things, and all of the megatrends we're talking about today have shown signs of being exponential. That's cool. The problem is we don't know how to react as humans. As I said before, or I think I said before, we're genetically wired to think in a linear way. We just are. That's what human beings are. And so there's all sorts of interesting proof points and kind of mind tests to bring this to life. One that I ran across recently has to do with money. And this has nothing to do with the compounding impact of interest or what have you. It has to do with just how the mind thinks about the difference between linear and exponential. So I'm going to ask for 2 volunteers here very quickly. And now we know why no one sits in the front row, because almost inevitably I'm going to pick volunteers from the front row here. So can I have 2 people just willing to raise their hand? You're not going to have to come up on stage or anything. I just want you to be the 2 participants. Come on. Anyone? Thank you. I appreciate that. And can we have one more over here? All right, you know what? We're not going to do it with participants. If no one's going to play along, and by the way, you have to play along. This is going to be a really boring day if you don't get into it. So we're going to do this side of the room versus that side of the room, all right? And I'm from the US, so you have to forgive me. I'm going to use US currency here. This side of the room, I'm going to give $1 a day to for 30 days. Okay, $1 a day for 30 days. Do the math. How much money do you think you have at the end? Don't yell it out. It's a simple question. $1 a day for 30 days. This side of the room, I'm going to give a penny, 1 cent, 1/100th of a dollar on the first day. On the second day, I'm going to give you 2 pennies. On the third day, I'm going to give you 4, and then 8, and so on. Which side wins? Who has more money at the end? Everyone wants to be on that side of the room now. How much money do you have? The more important question. Yell it out. Guess. Anyone in the room. How much money does this side of the room have after 30 days? $1,000? Anyone else? Couple of billion? Not quite, but that's headed the right direction. It's $10 million. Which is just, it might be mind-blowing to some of you, it may be curious to others of you, but we just don't think that way. Our brains don't think that way, and that's the problem behind exponentials. So I'm going to rewind now almost 10 years ago to an article I wrote for Harvard Business Review that thankfully was well acclaimed, and it was based on a hypothesis that amongst all innovators, everyone knew that innovators got paid a capital markets premium. So if you're great at creating new economic value time and time again, people will want to own your stock. Our hypothesis at the time was even amongst that cream of the crop, There are some who out-earn their peers all the time because they're able to maintain for themselves a strategically relevant portfolio of innovations at any given point in time. And so the way that we set that up and did the research was using this framework over on the left-hand side. It's something we call the Innovation Ambition Matrix, and it's a very simple way of looking at the world of innovation that says any organization, whether you're a startup or a scaled, successful Fortune 100 company, any organization can innovate across 3 different levels of ambition. You can innovate in your core business, which is all about incrementally improving what you do day in, day out to serve the customers you have today. Sometimes edging into new customer groups or doing things a little bit differently for them. On the other end of the spectrum, you have transformational innovation, which the way we defined it was the deployment of new capital to discover needs that the world has never expressed before. So if you believe part of what Steve Jobs says about the success of Apple, that's the place they play. He would say, we respect our customers, but we don't listen to them. We actually try to anticipate for them what is going to thrill them next. That's transformational innovation. And then you've got this whole space in the middle, the adjacent space, which is about stretching your capabilities to enter new markets and to do things differently for your customers, and sometimes very stretchy, sometimes just a little stretchy. And so to make a long story short, we did the research. Thankfully, the hypothesis turned out to be true. Otherwise, I don't think they would have given us the cover of their magazine. And what we discovered was, and this is something HBR called the golden innovation ratio. We discovered that the average company, and not many companies are average, but the first half of the article establishes an average. The average company should spend 70% of its time and focus on the core, 20% in the adjacent space, and 10% in the transformational space. That's the winning formula. Or I should say, that was the winning formula. And weirdly, over a 3 to 5 year time frame, the returns from their innovation system were the inverse. So 70% of what they earned came from the few big, bold bets in the transformational space, 20% from the adjacent, and 10% from the core. Interesting set of numbers. A lot of the world has adopted this, the so-called golden innovation ratio, as a way to run their business. And as I've been out in the world for the last decade talking about this, I've discovered 2 things and have concluded a third. The 2 discoveries are, number one, no one has any clue where their spend is today. They just don't. It's not something they measure. You ask the average executive, they can't tell you with any degree of precision how they split their spend between core, adjacent, and transformational. The second is that everyone way overestimates the degree to which they're operating outside the core. Sometimes companies ask us to come in and look at their innovation pipeline, and for the vast majority of companies in the world, it's like 95 or 96% of what they're doing is stuck in the core business. And there's a few glimmers of interesting adjacent and transformational innovations that they're working on that get all the attention, but not the funding. And so the companies are deluding themselves that they're being sufficiently innovative. The conclusion I've drawn over that period of time is that while the framework stands and is actually very helpful, the numbers are defunct. They're done. 70-20-10 no longer works. It's just not the reality of today's world a decade later. We haven't redone the study, but if I had to guess what the ratio is today, the golden innovation ratio, I'd argue it's probably something more like 50-30-20. And that's because of the impact of exponentials. Going back to what I had to say before, we are seeing a massive opportunity migration out of our core businesses and into spaces that we need to increasingly be paying attention to. So in my first book, Detonate, I borrowed the ambition matrix, and I just created this simple visual and set up the argument that, look, there's really 2 different types of opportunities that we face in the world today. And you should still be able to see the curves of the ambition matrix behind there. In the core and near adjacent space, you have what I call the known or knowable opportunities. They're knowable because the markets exist. There are customers out there who you can go to and say, what if I did this for you? Would you like it? Would you pay for it? Would you switch to me from our competitors? And you're going to get reasonably good data back. Above that line, though, the diagonal intersect, is what we call the unknown and in some cases unknowable space. These are markets that don't exist. These are markets that may develop in the future, and they're customer needs that are being served that customers don't even know that they have themselves. The migration that I talked about before on account of exponentials is happening from the known space to the unknown space. 10 years ago when I wrote that article, if you take that 70-20-10 and split the 20 roughly in half, 80% of the world's opportunity lay in the known and knowable space. I would argue if 80% of the opportunity is there, just go focus on that. Don't worry about all the stuff above the line and the unknown or unknowable. But if you believe my hypothesis that we're now at something like 50, 30, 20 and rapidly accelerating up and to the right, we're soon going to be at a place where the opportunity, and when I talk opportunity here, this is the opportunity for any company to create new economic value, but it's also the moves you need to make to avoid disruption. We're soon going to be in a place where more than half of the opportunity is above the line in the unknown or unknowable space. The difference between the area below the line and the area above the line, though, is this. Below the line, you're managing risk. Okay? You are using data to take risky decisions and make them unrisky. Above the line, you're facing uncertainty. And that takes a fundamentally different skill set and a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. Risk is measurable, and therefore it's manageable. Uncertainty, by definition, is not measurable. You think about what we all just have lived through and continue to live through with the pandemic. We've gone through 19 months of uncertainty. Suddenly, people understand what uncertainty feels like. We don't have guideposts or data from the past to tell us what to do. It's uncertain, so we just go do stuff. We take small steps, we provoke a reaction from the outside world and see what happens. That's how you deal with uncertainty. So the first book that I wrote, called Detonate, is all about blowing up the playbooks of the past in order to deal with that uncertainty and to be able to move forward. And I'm tempted to take you into some of the details of it, but most of the book has to do with the playbooks that we see in most organizations that actually prevent them from moving forward. And they're very comfortable processes like annual strategic planning and risk management systems and financial forecasting. All of these things are really important if you're dealing with known or knowable data. But companies are deluding themselves if they believe that those processes and those mechanisms are helpful to them as they face uncertainty. They just don't work and they don't matter. So the new book, if the old book is about, or I shouldn't say it's old, it came out 3 years ago, so it's maturing. Why don't I put it that way? My maturing book is about blowing up the playbooks of the past to move forward. The new book, Provoke, is about actually catalyzing action as we move towards the future. And we open the book with a story about an executive from the world of telecommunications. And this is a real person, by the way, that my co-author, Steve Goldbach, who's the Deloitte US Chief Strategy Officer, this is someone he actually served and interacted with in the market. It's a real story. And the story is about Steve in the executive's office one day, and they're talking about a weird emerging trend. So this executive had a big part of their business focused on delivering cable television. Really big, profitable business, one of the biggest cable TV companies in the US and, in fact, in the world. And the quote that we open the book with is 1.75%. Why would I care? That was the reaction that the executive had to some data that Steve had just shared with him. And the data that Steve had just shared with him is there's something weird going on in your customer base. We don't really know what's going on, but these customers, they don't fit a lot of the segments that you have in your segmentation. They seem to be people who don't want the TV channels. They just want internet. They just want things to be fast. And they want to get things on demand. And the executive's reaction was 1.75%? Why would I care about them? You roll the tape forward 20 years, and the executive's long gone, needless to say. That company is now a fraction of the size of Netflix, which is what that early signal was calling attention to. And so the core premise in Provoke is that the best leaders these days are able to take action in the face of imperfect data, or in the case of no data. We have a very simple framework, and you'll see a lot of the illustrations here. There's a great illustrator we had do both books named Tom Fishburne, and he literally saves you thousands of words if you ever choose to read the books. This is one of his as well that talks about the if-to-when curve that we establish in the book. And what we mean by this is that whenever we face an uncertainty, whenever we don't really know what's going to happen, we need to look at it with this lens. Some uncertainties just they go away. We're considering them, they don't end up being real, they go away, we never had to worry about them. But other uncertainties go through a phase change at some point. where they stop becoming a question of if they're going to happen and start becoming a question of when they're going to happen. We may not know everything about them, we may not know where they're going to land or what their rate of change is going to be, but it's now past a point where we don't really know if it's going to happen. We call that interstitial period the phase change. We're not exactly super creative dudes, we're strategy consultants, so we just name things what they are. So as you go through that phase change from if to when, the best executives are those who are able to position themselves to, first of all, recognize the phase change earlier than others, and secondly, position themselves and their organizations to create the most advantage possible as they go through the phase change. So how do they position for that? One is by simply looking at the world differently. So this slide is a very simple picture of how most of the world, when faced with linear projections, looks forward. Imagine yourself on the left-hand side looking forward. We kind of have a dominant version of what the future is going to be. We don't know everything about it, but we're saying, okay, that's likely the way that the world is going to turn out. We're not going to put all our eggs in one basket, so we're going to say there's some upsides and some downsides, and we'll consider a range of possible outcomes, and we'll plan for the downsides just in case. And if we're in a cyclical industry, we will definitely understand there are cycles, but the cycles operate within some basic boundaries. And so historically, in a linear world, we've been able to look forward into the future and say, okay, this is the range of outcomes that I can consider. And I'm going to make my decisions and take my risk out of my decisions accordingly. The impact of exponentials, though, is a requirement that we massively increase our field of vision. The range of outcomes as we look towards the future are now becoming almost infinite. That sounds like an overstatement, but we can't predict it with any degree of precision. The problem is, even the most enlightened executives, and I know a lot of people in this room probably understand intuitively everything I'm saying here. They know they can't put all their eggs in one basket. They know that they got to consider all the different possibilities out there. Even the most successful, most visionary executives who kind of understand that need to have a broader field of vision inadvertently end up really limiting their vision because they're human, which is a sad condition for all of us, but we are. We're just guided by human nature, and that means that we're guided by the same human biases that impact us in all walks of life. And so the fatal flaws that we refer to in the subtitle of Provoke have to do with some of those human biases. They're just things that naturally are a reality. So for example, and I've put 5 up here, an availability bias. We tend to have a preference for data that's more readily available. And when I say a preference, I mean we believe information that is easier to get than information that's really hard to get. Because if it's really hard to get, it can't be real. So we're going to go generally with the information that's at our fingertips, that our strategists and our organizations can deliver to us easily. Status quo bias. We as humans are loss averse. And when something changes, we lose something. So whether we like to admit it or not, we kind of like things to stay pretty much the same. Not exactly the same, but pretty much the same. Big change hurts, and we don't like it. Egocentric bias. We tend to have a preference for the decisions we've made. We believe or we place more faith in our point of view than in others' point of view. Not because we're bad or because we are actually egotistical, but because we live in our brains. We just have a preference for the things we believe over what others believe. Overconfidence bias. On account of all of this, we are overconfident that we've made the right decisions in the past. And then the last one I put up here, affect heuristic bias, is about having a preference for or being drawn to things that cause a stronger emotional reaction. One of the reasons it's very hard for people who are starting to exercise, having not exercised in the past, is that the pain that is required to get off the couch and go and do something is so strong that the payoff X years down the future when we get more fit just doesn't seem worth it. That's affect heuristic bias. When you get these human biases all interacting together in an organization, then you get some weird tendencies that start to emerge. So generally, we try to avoid embarrassment in meetings. We don't want to call people out. We want to be polite. And so you start seeing or hearing things like, let's take it offline. Let's cover this outside the room. We'll cover that in a different meeting. And all of a sudden, we all get hit with 20 and 30-minute just check-ins to be able to try to resolve an issue that we didn't want to try to resolve in front of everyone else, and there's no time to do anything else. And so in the interest of time, I won't go through what happens when all these things collide, but systemically, as people in organizations work together, we inadvertently create organizational blinders that prevent us from seeing the full aperture that we know we need to be paying attention to as we look towards the future. There is a very simple way to get rid of that, and Anders made reference to it at the very beginning. The only way you can open things back up, recognizing we're not going to stop being human anytime soon, is to increase cognitive diversity in your organization. And cognitive diversity only comes from actual diversity, and actual diversity only matters if it's paired with equity and inclusion. I'm not up here, by the way, trying to morally preach to you. All of that happens to be a moral imperative, but it's also just a good business decision. It's how you get rid of these blinders, not by ripping off the blinders, but by introducing others who have different views of the world and different data to draw from. So I want to make sure that we leave enough time for some Q&A here. I'll show you this picture here. This is what most of the book Provoke is about. They are the actions that you need to take in order to take all of that newfound wide field of vision and do something with it. And so our argument is you go through multiple different stages as you pass through the phase change. There is a foundational capability around envision, which is about essentially saying we can't look forward to the future anymore and assume we can predict it. We have to have the humility to say we have no clue what's going to happen. So instead of predicting the future, we need to think about scenarios for the future. We need to think in ways that allow for multiple competing versions of how the future might unfold and spread our bets accordingly. And importantly, shift those bets over time as new information comes in about how the future is actually unfolding. Once you've done that envisioning, you can position yourself better to see the phase change. And then importantly, as you see the phase change start to take hold, either drive towards the outcomes that are advantageous to you if you have a clear line of sight for what's happening and you actually have some control over the market, or you can activate an ecosystem around you. Anders talked about some of our alliances that we use out there today as partnerships because we can't do everything on our own as Deloitte, even as one of the world's biggest companies. So we work with others to activate activity in the market. And then sometimes you just need to adapt. The future's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be one that you can shift. And even though people know that sometimes adapting, even if adapting means winding down your company, is the right thing to do, it's really, really hard emotionally to achieve it. So I'm going to stop talking now in order to do some Q&A. I really do encourage those of you online that are still with us, hopefully you're still with us, to send in some questions. I would love to hear any of your reactions to what I've said, as well as challenges. This is meant to set up part of the discussion that you're going to have throughout the course of the day today, and I hope, if nothing else, you've taken away from this that as we look at these megatrends, as we look at the things that are impacting the world around us, they are not knowable, but we can still deal with them, and we can still act with purpose, even in the face of uncertainty. So with that, I think we'll have some Q&A, and thank you for the attention, and kind of playing along. You really didn't play along that well, especially with the whole money thing. So hopefully for some of the future speakers, you will.
Thank you, Geoff. And that's because most Danes do have a problem, talking about money. But that's the thing. As you said, please, as well here in the audience, if you have any questions, just raise your hands. And I know how engaged you could be, so do that. And if you are sitting and watching this, I have all your questions here. Right now, there's nothing. But I have some. And I have to say sorry because I was wrong before. I did a wrong introduction for you. I have flaws.
But at least I got an introduction.
Yeah. That's right.
Right.
But that's your new book got out. The Provoke was the one that was the bestseller. The other one is already a bestseller.
Yes.
Congratulations for that one.
Thank you for calling attention to that.
So Geoff, if a question is, how do we create and nurture a culture that promotes change and can help provoke the change we want to?
And for those of you that didn't hear that, how do we provoke? How do create a culture that allows for change and provokes the change that we want? I would say there's lots of mechanisms for that, but if I had to be a little bit provocative, I'd say stop following the rules. So stop doing what you're told to do all the time without actually thinking about it. There's a problem that most organizations have, and that is that they have things called orthodoxies. They're like the conventional wisdom of how this place operates. It's like how we close the books at the end of a quarter. It's what our competitors might do if we make a move in the market. It's how we start a meeting and end a meeting. And if we all just act by orthodoxy and conventional wisdom all the time, nothing's going to change. And so the number one piece of advice I have for most organizations starting their change journey is not challenge everything, not blow up every playbook and start running around and burning the place down. That's ridiculous. But to make orthodoxy discussable. So you can say, you know what? I actually can't think of a good reason why we're doing things this way. Can we try something different? And if you just start having the conversation, then things do change.
So where should the change come from? Is that the top, the leaders? Should it come from you? Should it come from the bottom? Where should it come from?
That's a great question that we get all the time, and there's no simple answer to it, but the simplest answer I can give is it's got to be kind of a pincer movement. So there's no way that any senior executive, especially senior executives that have grown up within an industry or a company who are super successful, there's no one that I've met so far that is sufficiently brave to say, you know what, everything I've learned from the past is wrong, and I'm going to enable change and force it from the top because it's just not the way that we're wired. But they can create the conditions and the top cover to say, you know what, I'm not open to burning the place down, obviously. We have a core business, and it's really important to hear everything I say as valuing a balance between running a core business and actually continuing to operate and yield cash in the short term, even as we change things. So the most enlightened top-down moves I've seen from executives is to say, I've got a business to run here, but I am open to demonstration that we can do things differently. I'm open to people taking the initiative to show how we can challenge those orthodoxies and do things differently, and then people have to take up that charge and start to try to actually demonstrate that small steps forward in the face of uncertainty can actually yield different types of results. And I don't think that necessarily has to come from the bottom. And sometimes it's really difficult from the very bottom, the brand new employees, to really challenge things. But there's an important principle that we talk about in Detonate around the beginner's mind and the value that you get if you're a brand new beginner to a situation, if you've never seen it before. There is some real originality and creativity there that doesn't have to come from being a brilliant genius. It's just because you're looking at things from first principles. And that's the kind of pincer movement that I'm talking about.
We have a question. Perfect. Could we get some microphone?
Or just
right
yell
here?
And I'll repeat
yeah,
it.
Just in front. We just need to get people to hear the questions as well. So, and the mic is on.
All right, I have a question about a skill gap. Because when you see a company, for instance, nobody in the company have machine learning or AI experience. Maybe the company know this is important from the newspaper and a conference like this. But what would you advise a company to do where they don't have anyone in the company with that skill? Because when you don't have the skill, there's a risk that you don't focus on it. And so what is your advice to all the skill gap there are in many companies where they are missing skills to get focus on it?
Yeah, great question. Again, I'm going to offer an answer that I feel like I need to caveat because nothing is straightforward, nothing is black and white, but I'll just give you the best answer I can as directly as I can. The first is fix your talent strategy, but do it gradually over time. Don't go and change everything. Don't assume you need to hire a bunch of new AI engineers because AI is the hot new thing. Make sure you can demonstrate that it works in the short term and then let it unfold. Sometimes you can do that by hiring small groups of people to staff innovation functions, for example, to go and do something sequestered from the core. I think a much better move, and Anders used this phrase at the beginning, open up. Like, let others in. Start looking for interesting partnerships you can have in the market with smaller startups. For any of you that represent big-scaled companies, the weird mindset of big, successful companies these days is, oh no, we're going to be disrupted. You're only going to be disrupted if you don't actually do something proactively. You own the market today. You know your customers the best. And if you can actually retain that position, you're going to be best positioned to continue on into the future, but only if you can actually operate differently. And the fastest way to do that is draw startups into you, draw entrepreneurs into you, not as wholly captivated employees, but as partners, and figure out the value flow in a way that where you can start to demonstrate what works and then scale from there. So I'd say start with partnerships and then take it in-house if that's the right thing to do strategically.
Thank you for the question. We have one, and it should be short. But we have one from online, from Thomas Remington. He's writing here. Uncertainty is great to a high extent, not really human behavior, but I agree it's necessary. What about doing some small field market tests in order to learn more and faster, which should by the end lead to less uncertainty? Are there any good company practice examples to share?
So I think whoever asked that question completely nailed it. We've taken a concept called minimally viable products, which everyone knows about these days, the idea of taking something, a new development, engineering it a little bit and then putting it in the market and see what the reaction is. You can do that with any management decision. So we call those minimally viable moves, another brilliant naming convention, of course, where you boil down anything you want to do to its smallest testable hypothesis and then go do it. Just go do it and see what happens in the market. And so to the point about field tests or market tests, small tests, that's exactly what you're doing there because you're getting data from the uncertain world. You're adding contours to that uncertainty by actually doing something. And the key that we all have to remember as we do that, and as we deal with uncertainty generally, is data is by definition retrospective. It just is. There's no magic, so no, I don't care how powerful your AI systems are, there's no magic AI that perfectly projects into the future. It's all based on what we've learned from the past. Increasingly, we're discovering that lessons from the past actually aren't good guides. They don't help us make good decisions. They do for some part of our business, but not the entirety of it. And so the only way that we can complement a super powerful AI or intelligence or data management system is to be able to go out and do those small field tests in everything that we do and gather more information about the uncertainties.
Perfect. Thank you, Geoff. Should we give him a big hand?
Absolutely. Enjoy the day. Thanks. It was great being with you. And I will be around all day if anyone wants to have a chat. I'm here. So thank you.